I'm not going to say that there aren't any other positive attributes, but let's talk about some of the more negative ones. I think once you've accepted and gotten past the inaccurate voices, I think the next major flaw, which we've already kind of talked about, is some of the animation, which is really pretty bad at times.
Yeah, the animation again was, you can understand it. It was a little bit limited, especially the sing-alongs, because they wanted to save money, so they would use a stock scene and just drag it across the pan cell, if you know what that is.
Yeah, that was really cheap.
Yeah, it was very cheap, which, again, that's fine. The kids didn't care, as long as they saw the Beatles. The animation later, as it turned out, while it was much better in the UK for some of the last season episodes, a lot better.
Noticeably, yeah.
But if you watch the sing-alongs, they didn't even bother to put the Beatles in the sing-alongs.
Yeah, they use a deck of cards or something.
Yeah, or for Good Day Sunshine, it was, the flower, or Penny Lane, they showed pennies and pictures of barbers, and they never even put the Beatles in it. So, yes, the animation was not what it probably should have been, but I think it was great. Well, great, listen to me. I think it was good for what the purpose was supposed to be.
And it did improve later. It did improve. And the different studios had a chance in the second and third season to see what each other had done and maybe be influenced by each other.
Yes, but if you watch the third season, my favorite episode is the Strawberry Fields, which happened to be the last one ever done.
Yeah.
And that actually has a great shot of John with glasses. There's a couple of scenes where he has glasses, some better than others, but there's one particular scene where he just has the round glasses, and the only episode where he has glasses, and ironically, Paul has glasses in that episode too, in a scene, but that's the only one they ever had. Both of them had glasses, and it's definitely a much more sophisticated episode,
right? Which
was nice, animation-wise, but I'm sure we'll talk about it when it led to Yellow Submarine.
Yeah, we'll talk about Yellow Submarine.
Sure.
But, there are mistakes, and I understand that if there's a missing limb or something or a technical error, they don't have the time or the budget to go back and correct it. There are cases where they have the wrong voice coming out of the wrong Beatle or the wrong Beatle singing a song, either because the animator didn't realize it was a mistake or they didn't think it mattered much. But for a Beatle fan, those kind of errors were probably pretty annoying. And they reused a lot of footage. There's that one profile shot of John Lennon that, it looks a lot like him. It looks good, but oh my God, it started to get old after a while.
Yes, it did. I know exactly which one. But you know what? It does look good. So as long as it looked good, there are some. If you watch, I believe it's Not a Second Time. There's a shot of Paul, and I show in my presentation because I think it's one of the worst animated Beatle cartoon episodes because I try to show the good, bad, and the ugly in terms of animation. And that episode, if you go watch it again, there's a shot of Paul where he's got eyelashes and he looks like he's in drag. It's horrible, and I don't. And also the Beatles are drawn so small to scale.
Yeah.
And I'll get you they're riding on an elephant and they look bigger than the elephant.
Right.
So yes, it wasn't done well, and it did probably tick off a lot of the kids when voices were done. But again, they didn't have time to go back and re-record that stuff, and it didn't matter much as long as they heard the Beatle music.
There wasn't a ton of that, but you'd notice once in a while. In the second season, they did add more moves while they're performing a song. There'd be more moves for Ringo, more moves for George, more positions for John to stand in. You could tell that in the second one they'd had time to, so it wasn't quite as repetitive in the visual.
And also more money because once the Beatles started making the cartoon started making money, they could spend a little more. Even though I will tell you that Al Brodax was very frugal at the time, so even though they were making money, it didn't always mean it went back into the till, so to speak.
No.
But the one episode that I if you watch now, which I refer to in my book, but I didn't name it because I didn't know it until after the book came out. If you watch the episode for Come Give Me Your Dinah Hand, you can actually tell in the beginning when the Beatles are waving, they're in a cable car and they're yelling, the Beatles are coming. And when they go there, you can see as they're waving that there are two times when the Beatles' arms completely disappear while they're waving. So, and it's pretty noticeable with the naked eye. But if you slow it down,
freeze frame,
you could actually freeze it on the part where all their right arms are gone.
I'll have to go back and do that.
Oh yeah, it's very freaky. I've done it, and people say, "Oh my Lord, look at that!" But it's twice in there, so it's pretty cool.
You probably find that in a lot of different shows, though. I bet you could find stuff in the Flintstones and Beetle Bailey.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, one funny thing, and I do talk about it in the book, is the animators were playing jokes on each other. And in Babies in Black, at the end, the vampirist comes out of a cauldron as a beautiful witch, and the animators in one of the frames put the witch in panties.
Oh.
And you'd never see that with the naked eye, and they, because there's 24 frames to a second.
Right.
And they decided just in one frame it would never ever be seen. Now I have the film of that, and I've never actually gone back, and I should, but that would mean unraveling the film. And
the classic Disney guys, I heard, used to do that too, even back to like Snow White and Pinocchio and Dumbo.
Exactly.
They
so
color little
having fun with it, just to keep their sanity, so to speak.
Well, I heard that I think it was The Lion King, in the stars in the sky, the special effects department had made the stars spell SFX, special effects, but it looked an awful lot like SEX.
Yeah.
And when the DVD came out and people could freeze it, they weren't in the theater anymore. They made them, whatever the word is, pixelated.
Oh, yeah.
Well, let's talk about some of the factors that contributed to the eventual decline of the show. Sure, the initial response was unprecedented and phenomenal and spectacular, but no show could have sustained that level of viewership. Once the novelty factor had worn off and the reruns started to air, the ratings, dropped off significantly. They ordered 17 episodes in Season 1, 13 in Season 2, and 9 in Season 3. And as you said, by the fourth and final seasons, they were showing nothing but reruns. Would you agree that the lack of new content would have been a big turnoff to a lot of viewers?
Well, there's a bunch of things that contributed to this turning off of actually the cartoon. But think about it. If you have 13 cartoons, and that runs 4 times a year to make 52 weeks, the first time you see it, you're enthralled and you're sitting by the TV and you're just not leaving. The second time you see it, you're going to do the same thing, but not with the enthusiasm. By the third and fourth time, you're clicking off trying to find something else to watch because you've already seen it twice. So as much as the Beatle music was great, they could always go put on their Beatle record.
Yeah.
If they wanted to hear that song again, they didn't have to wait until it reran, and then it might have been on, and they might have watched it in the background, but that was one factor. Don't forget, at the end, John had made his statement about, bigger than Jesus, and all of the Bible Belt turned off.
Or the parents told their kids, you're forbidden from watching it.
Yeah, and also the Beatles were getting older. They were more mature. And in the third season of the cartoon, they actually showed the Beatles in the opening with mustaches. And they also chose And Your Bird Can Sing to be the opening song, which was not a hit. It was a great song. Don't get me wrong, one of my favorite Beatles songs, but it was an album cut, and not a single like the 2 prior seasons of Help and Can't Buy Me Love. So, it was a little bit of the Beatles' maturity as well. The Beatle fans grew up with the Beatles, meaning, they didn't watch cartoons once the Beatles were starting to go to India.
True.
So that also had a lot to do with it. But the biggest factor was the advent of live action Batman.
Right.
The Cape Crusader came along at night and really did the Beatles in, indirectly of course, but kids were watching superheroes, and once they hit big, all of the other stations decided, let's make cartoons about superheroes, where Superman, CBS even took some of the writers from the Beatles and used them on The Impossibles. I don't know if you remember that cartoon about 3 rock stars who were crime fighters.
No.
Oh yeah, the Impossibles. Look it up. They were singing crime fighters, which again we had some of the Beatles scriptwriters from them. I believe it was on CBS. And so once superheroes hit, Space Ghost was really big.
Right.
And once that hit, that was really the end of the Beatles. With other cartoons, that was the end of them, but as we said, everybody can go back and put on their Beatle albums and not watch a cartoon.
Well, I'm saying to air an entire season. Imagine if somebody tried to get away with that today. Welcome to Dexter Season 5. It's all repeats of last year. People would never stand for it. That's
No, well, by that time, I think it was on Sundays at that time at 12 o'clock.
Wow.
Sundays at 12 was not the greatest time slot at all. That was where cartoons and shows went to die. And that's what happened. I mean, they knew it wasn't doing as well. They knew they had to put it somewhere, and they did. And I mean, it did okay, but it didn't do anywhere near where it went. But again, all the other factors contributed to the people turning it off. Yeah. And then they let it go at 12 o'clock on Sunday, and eventually just said, no more.
Well, as a kid, I remember watching Space Ghost, and I didn't even know the Beatle cartoon existed. Were those in the same time slot? Were they direct competitors?
I'd have to go back and look. I'm not sure.
I think they might have been. So I was watching superhero cartoons for sure in the late 60s.
I was too. Yeah. I mean, I watched the Beatles, but I definitely was watching, Space Ghost a lot. And Superman on CBS was very, very big. Yeah. And Fred Silverman was a huge competitor of Al Brodax's. And so he loved the fact that he had something that would, give the Beatles a little bit of run for their money.
Right. Well, it's funny, when the Beatles came out, initially it gave everybody else a run for the money to the degree that CBS put out sound-alike shows like The Beagles.
Well, that only lasted for one season. Two dogs that were a rock duo, and they actually had an album out and a single, and if you can find them, it's pretty rare.
I'll bet.
And the episodes are nowhere to be.
It probably deserves to be rare.
Yes. Well, they also wanted, after the Beatles' success of the Beatles, obviously we saw the Osmonds and Jackson 5 as cartoons, but there was a concerted effort to try to get the Herman's Hermits. Gary and the Playboys, I just learned, were also approached, and Gary Lewis and the Playboys, and nobody had the time and the Beach Boys too. Nobody had the time to really sit and do a cartoon.
So they invented the Archies.
Yes, good old Don Kirshner.
Josie and the Pussycats.
Well, yeah.
Well, let me rewind a bit to what you were saying about the audiences growing up with the Beatles. As they were growing mustaches and longer hair, their cartoon counterparts were retaining the mop-top image, which may have made the cartoons seem a bit passé and outdated, particularly when you see them performing Penny Lane, looking like they're from 1964 Beatles.
Right, and that happened, well, I can't say it happened for all of them, because the last two cartoons made were, as we said, Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, but those were the only cartoons from 67, so to speak, from the era of mustaches. Everything prior, they did a lot of Revolver, but when we saw them, from Revolver, even now, you don't see them with any mustaches, just, always looking stoned with glasses, but they certainly didn't portray that in the cartoons. But you're right, I think just the opening itself set people off when they saw the 1967 publicity photo of the Beatles with the mustaches and stuff that we used in the opening. It was very contradicting, because there's the mustaches, and then there's also the 64 mop tops having fun adventures even in the opening of the cartoon. Yeah. So it was kind of confusing.
Totally. Well, let's go ahead and talk about Yellow Submarine. I think when you mention animation and the Beatles, that's probably the thing most people think of first before the Saturday morning cartoon show, but there are actually a lot of significant connections between those two projects.
There was. Well, at first there's an ad in my book where it announced that Al Brodax is going to make 4 half-hour specials with using the Beatle cartoons. Well, that never happened, but that did materialize into Yellow Submarine. Now, originally the plans were to have Yellow Submarine, because the Beatles were under contract for 3 films, and they had already done 2, 3 with United Artists, they contractually had to do something, but Al Brodax said, you know what, I want to make an animation film, and they said, okay, let's see what you got. But they didn't want it to be with the Saturday morning cartoon characters, the characterizations. They had enough, and they were ready. They had moved on from that mop-top era. So there's a connection there. It really was Brodax's baby again. You could tell more connections. It was done by TVC Studios, which did the bulk of the Beatle cartoons. They did Yellow Submarine. And even in the episode for Strawberry Fields, which is very Yellow Submarine-like in terms of animation, they have the sentence, "It's all in the mind, that ends the cartoon of Strawberry Fields. Mm-hmm. And they were working on Yellow Submarine at that point already, and there are 2 times in Yellow Sub where George says it's all in the mind,
Right.
So there are many, many connections there. And I'm pretty glad they didn't use the Saturday morning cartoons as Yellow Submarine, because I just don't think it would have been the classic that it is now.
Well, you know what came into my mind was your cowboy saying, "No way."
Exactly.
Can we make Yellow Submarine with them up? No way, not on my network.
Exactly.
Well, here's a connection for you. How about Lance Percival voicing a character in Yellow Submarine?
Absolutely. Lance Percival was. They did, even though they didn't like the voices, they did enjoy, Lance Percival, and they used him as Old Fred.
Old Fred?
Fred, whichever one you want to say.
Mm-hmm.
But he was Fred in the movie, so there's another connection.
There is an important connection between the movie and the TV show that we'll get to in a minute in terms of its status today. But I think it was fitting and appropriate that the cartoon series discontinued roughly at the same time that the Beatles ceased to exist as a recording entity. The Beatles broke up and the cartoon series sort of ended. But we've touched on some of this already, but let's talk a little bit about the legacy of the cartoon series. I mean, first and foremost, it was the first time that real-life entertainers were presented in animated form. I mean, that was a big deal.
Correct. Well, let me just correct you one way. It was the first weekly series to feature real-life performers in animated form.
Well, that's what I meant to say.
Well, okay, but people are then going to write in and say, well,
Bugs Bunny
in Bugs Bunny they had Humphrey Bogart and Abbott and Costello and the Marx Brothers. So I do want to just stress it was the first weekly series. So it was a pioneer in the animation industry as well.
And as you mentioned, it paved the way, like it or not, for the Jackson 5 cartoon, the Osmonds, Brady Bunch kids, all those different things that came are pretty much modeled on that style. Yeah,
Partridge Family even had their cartoon. It was Partridge Family, 2010 AD or whatever it was. And when you say the Osmonds and Jackson 5, if you look at them, I mean, they're just silly. I mean, Michael had a pet snake in the cartoons. The Osmonds had rats or something, or maybe it was Donnie who had the snake and Michael had two mice.
Probably because of the song Ben.
Very good. But who knows? I mean, but they were just as silly. Even though the music was great for both of them, the cartoons were just as silly. So, yeah, I don't think the Beatles were too far off in what they were doing back then.
No, I watched the Jackson 5 one. I remember watching those in the early 70s, and I enjoyed them. I have a question that I don't know the answer to, and hopefully you do. When the Beatles anthology came out in the 90s, the specials that they broadcast were shown on ABC. Was that a coincidence, or was it a direct result of their relationship from the cartoon days?
No, that was just a coincidence.
Okay.
But oddly enough, I was kind of ticked off that they, even in the DVDs that came out of, the 10 hours long one, they do not mention the cartoons anywhere, with the exception of when George is talking about visiting Elvis. He says, we were in our car, all four of us, and we were giggling, going up the, wherever, Mulholland Drive, whatever it was. And then when the car door opened up, we all fell out of the car like the old Beatle cartoons. I mean, that's the only time. But I will say, if you listen to some of the Let It Be outtakes, there is a day when the Beatles were recording some of the stuff in the studio, and Paul says, hey, guys, listen to this. And he starts playing a bass riff. And he says, hey, it's the old Beatle cartoons. And then they all start joining in with like a boom, 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 like the ending of the Beatle cartoons.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so it's kind of cool to actually hear that.
Well, of course, initially they were dismissive of the cartoon series, but their attitude seems to have mellowed over the years. The example you gave of George talking about meeting Elvis and speaking kind of warmly of it. Also, apparently John Lennon used to send personal assistants to Beatle collector events to find 16-millimeter prints that he could watch at home.
Yeah, he enjoyed them a lot.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of nice to hear. And, George was interviewed when the Yellow Submarine was re-released, and he had a lot to say about the cartoons, very fondly, which was nice. Paul Ringo really liked them in terms of, Paul and Ringo never have come out and publicly said, oh, we love them. Paul always gives if you listen, there's this audio of Paul talking about the voices, and the same thing with Yellow Submarine, and he criticizes that too. He said he wanted to make it like a Disney film, and it didn't.
Yeah.
But now in hindsight, the Apple Corps Limited have licensed a lot of Beatle cartoon merchandise. So maybe they're all softening.
I find it interesting that while the Beatles banned the cartoon from being shown in England, their official tour program cover for their final tour of Britain in December '65 featured a picture from the animated series, which the English fans presumably knew nothing about. Do you think they meant that as a joke, or?
I just think someone said, you know what, they're popular, let's put them on, meaning on the cover, because they didn't have any other covers. I mean, none of the Beatles tour covers were ever that great, in my opinion.
It just seemed like an odd choice to say, we're going to ban this cartoon from England. Oh, we're going to tour England? Oh, let's put the cartoon images on the program.
Well, that's a great point, and there was a handshake agreement between Al Brodax and Brian Epstein that the Beatles cartoons would, because of the voices, would not ever be shown in the UK. Now, that stuck until John Lennon was murdered, and they showed a few on BBC or Granada TV in the 80s. But still to this day, I get email all the time from people in the UK who have never seen a Beatles cartoon. I mean, it's easier now because there's some, obviously, uploads on YouTube.
Yeah.
But they've never been released and never really seen in the UK.
Well, if I was an English fan in, I don't know, Blackpool or something, and they came to my town on tour and the program had animated likeness, I would just think it was some cute little thing somebody did. I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that it was a whole series being shown in America.
But wouldn't it be great to find out that it was?
Oh, totally.
I mean, now it whets your appetite, so to speak.
Definitely. Well, let's talk about the resurgence of the cartoon in the 80s. I think the impetus was the Beatle catalog coming out on CD for the first time, and MTV started to air episodes of the cartoon, but they chopped out the sing-along segments and the open and closing sequences.
They didn't chop out the sing-alongs.
Oh, they didn't?
No, they chopped out a lot of the openings. They went with one opening, Anya Bird Can Sing. They left out the first one to be politically correct.
Oh, yeah.
There's a scene where Ringo
dives in a garbage can.
Yeah, and maybe it wasn't as politically correct as they thought it should have been.
Right.
So they cut that out. They cut out all of the in-between bits, all the little and now a word from our sponsor, which really made the show complete. That, from what we remembered, and there were cute little vignettes. So that was cut out. Really, just the episodes and the sing-alongs were in there.
Okay.
But they did really well.
Yeah, I didn't see the show when it originally aired, but I remember seeing it at some point, so I must have seen it on MTV. Did you see it in the 60s?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I was 3 when the Beatles cartoons came out, and I know most people say, oh, he can never remember when he was 3, and maybe I don't, but my parents sat me in front of the TV, and I did watch Sullivan with them, and because my mother was a big Paul fan, and I did watch the cartoons, and we do have movies of me doing that. But my father's friend was the owner of a record store here in New York, and I used to get Beatle records 2 weeks in advance.
Sweet.
So it was kind of cool, even though I was very young. I do remember spinning the records on my turntable with my family.
One last thing about the relationship between the cartoon series and the Yellow Submarine motion picture involves who has the rights now. Why don't you tell us how that fell together?
Well, both of them are owned by Apple Corps Limited. It was a deal done between King Features, more Al Brodax representing King Features. In 1995, the Yellow Submarine was, I should say, sold back or sold to Apple. And the Beatle cartoons were a throw-in deal, which to this day I can't understand, but I guess they just didn't think that they were worthy of it, even though they had done really well in 86 and 87 on MTV. They were the highest-rated show on MTV those 2 years, which now if you find a Beatle on MTV, it's amazing. But if you find music on MTV, it's amazing. But and talk about political correctness, I won't even get into that. But they were a throw-in in the deal. So Apple has them. I did help them catalog the negatives. Well, not there, but via phone. And they've got them.
Do you think their intention when they acquired them, apparently as an afterthought, was to shelve it, to say, let's get control of these so we can shelve it?
Yes.
Or it was definitely?
I'm not going to say definitely.
That's the impression you got.
That's the impression I got.
The boys don't like it. Let's take it off the market.
Right.
Can you envision a scenario where they might decide to officially release it?
I could have a few years ago when they started licensing the cartoon merchandise. I'm not so sure now because there were rumors for years that they were going to release a best of because they didn't want the whole series out because of political correctness.
Yeah.
And that to me is a bunch of junk because there are so many cartoons on DVD right now that are so un-PC.
Right.
You know, Popeye and a ton of them. And even Tom and Jerry, you know, were beating each other up way before Itchy and Scratchy on.
Very violent.
So I really think that back a few years ago I could have. I just don't know anymore. I hope that they will, because sooner or later there's going to be nothing left to release.
Right.
I mean, think about it. I mean, I don't think they're going to release Let It Be, even though it was remastered for Anthology and looked gorgeous. Yeah. I don't think they're going to release that. They've already said, even when Neil Aspinall was alive, they said that, you know, the Beatles thought it was not what they wanted to represent.
Yeah.
So they're not going to release that. They're missing the boat with like a Shea Stadium release, because that was actually on TV.
Yeah.
I don't know why they're just not releasing it.
I'd love to see that.
Yeah, a Hollywood Bowl compilation would be really nice.
Love to see that too.
And listen, when Beatles 1 first came out, the first thing I said was, "Where's the companion DVD?"
Right.
Because Anthology cuts off. You know, Revolution in the Anthology goes all the way to the end until one line in the middle, and I was like, "Oh, come on!"
Right.
So you know, there's no even real promo DVD out there. But just as I was talking to Tony, and we'll get into who Tony is in a minute, but I was talking to my buddy Tony, and we were saying, you know, I have a feeling the age of physical product is gone with the advent of iTunes, because, you know, recently the Beatles put out the Beatles Anthology on iTunes. I have a feeling that that's what they're going to be doing from now on. DVD-wise, I mean, I think they're going to be releasing videos. You're going to have to pay for them and download them.
It's very possible that physical product's on its way out. The ramifications for that we'll see down the road. I just want to be a little more specific for our listeners about the political incorrectness we're talking about. It's mostly racial. As we said, some of the cartoons were done by Australians, and for them the memory of World War II was still pretty fresh, and they had a bitterness towards Japan, who had been a real threat of invasion for them. So their caricatures of the Japanese were very unflattering, let's say. There's also some insensitive stereotyping of African witch doctors and things like that. But I would say none of it's worse than, you know, some of the stuff you see in Disney.
Correct. I agree with that. I mean, yes. Will someone maybe get offended by Dr. Osso? Probably. But we have to remember, people, that it's a cartoon.
And it's of its time.
Yeah, and of its time, exactly.
And it's only like 2 or 3 episodes. It's not like, you know, you did 78 of them and 64 of them are racist. There's like a couple little incidents.
Right. I mean, you know, maybe Mr. Moonlight, if people know that one, that's maybe a little bit. But again, in the scheme of things, I don't think it's worth shelving the project. And as far as voices, unfortunately, 2 of the Beatles are gone.
Yeah.
You know, what are we going to wait for?
Right.
Everybody to be gone, or the baby boomers to be gone?
Right. Well, you know, maybe the Beatles' kids or grandkids or great-grandkids will have a different view of it, and they'll want to make it public.
Well, if they even know what the Beatles cartoons are.
Well, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I mentioned that I watched all these cartoons to do the research, so there are ways of getting it.
Right. No, I understand.